Good evening, everybody. And if you can't hear me at any point tonight, just wiggle or do that so I know, and I'll bring my volume up. And as Bob mentioned, each night one of us will give a talk that we hope will support your practice, maybe inspire your practice in some way. And I'm realizing that sometimes my words don't make sense, and especially because I'm speaking in English, which may not be your first language. So I ask that you listen from your heart and don't get lost with the words or the details or any of that. Just listen from here, and I think from this place I hope it makes sense in some way. And just want to acknowledge you've completed your first full day of practice, or we're kind of at the end of that first full day of practice. And it can be quite something to stay with the body, to stay with the breath, to stay with sounds, eating, chewing, swallowing. And no doubt throughout the day, some of us may have had the experience of like, what am I doing here? And you may have already counted the days till you get to go home. Or some of you might be saying, how much longer do I get to stay here? So I imagine on the retreat, we'll just move between those two kind of ranges of how much longer do I get to go home till I get to go home, and how much longer till I get to stay. And there's some work to being present moment to moment. It really is a practice, and it may be something that we're not always used to doing. So this question that I want to just kind of explore and talk about a little bit tonight is, what brings me to practice? And I think it's a really important, essential question. And it's one that I try to ask myself regularly. Sometimes in the morning before I sit, it's like, why am I practicing? So that it's not just a habit, there's an intention to it. That there's an intentionality of why am I practicing? And there's not necessarily, with a goal, there's a hope to achieve something in the future, but an intention holds more of a state of being right here, right now. So even though we spent a little bit of time last night introducing ourselves and saying what brings us here, what brings us, I think just, stop for a moment and just sincerely ask yourself, what brings you to practice? Why are you practicing? To really take a moment to investigate that for yourself. And if this was the last few moments of your life, how would you answer that? What brings you to practice? So, of course, we all have our own reasons and background story of what brings us to practice. But if we just go a little bit underneath that story and dig in a little bit deeper, there might be something else. Often there's a sense that maybe there's just something not quite right, something missing, something more in life. Does anybody have that feeling ever? Yeah. So there's this sense like there's something more. And I think, what's really calling us? What's our heart longing for? And for me, when I think about it, and like I said, it's a question I come to regularly, and I think there's something about the longing for freedom, that there's a place in me that wants to be free inside, to have a sense of peace, a sense of equanimity, no matter what the circumstances are, to have a sense of feeling connected, a sense of healing. And that may be true for some of you, and that may be different. And I think one of the interesting things, or at least I think it's interesting, is that the part of me, or the part of us that longs for freedom, has already tasted it. Because if we didn't know it already, we wouldn't know what to long for. So there's some place inside of us, some deep, essential place that has already touched and tasted this freedom, and our heart's calling us back there. And often this inner freedom, or our essential nature, gets hidden and trapped by our history, by our identity, by our conditioning, by our patterning. I think we all know the story about that, right? Those well-worn paths that we can get caught up and get tangled in. So we practice to awaken, to become free, to see what's here in this moment, to see what's real. And we can begin, when we practice, to begin to see who we really are without our mental constructions. And we can begin to know ourselves in a way free from our conditioning. And it's not that we totally let go of our history or the conditions or the things that shaped us. I don't know if we can, but we can be free from them, that we can transform those conditions, that history, those experiences that have shaped us. Those begin to become the compost for our transformation. That's the fuel for our journey. So it's not that we bypass and push that all away. No, we take it all in because it's part of us. It's part of our humanity. It's part of who we are. And it becomes kind of that grist for the mill. And that freedom that many of us are looking for, that awakening or that sense of healing or peace, it's not out there, it's in here. But we've become patterned or conditioned to look outside of ourselves. Instead, to look right here with what's here right now. So I want to share a teaching story, a wisdom story from the Buddha's life. So it's a story that's over 2,500 years old, and I think many of you have heard it, but I just want to talk about it a little bit because I think it can be something to support and inspire our practice. And so this is the story of the heavenly messengers. How many people here have heard about the heavenly messengers or familiar with that story? Yeah, so a number of you, and of course, each of us has our own telling of it. So again, if it's a familiar story to you, see if there's something new in it that you can hear. And the Heavenly Messengers is a story about one of the first realizations that Siddhartha Gautama, who later became the Buddha, the awakened one, it's one of the first realizations that he had. And Siddhartha was born into a royal family. He was a prince, and he was destined to become king. So there was an outline and a path already set for him since his birth. Here's your path to follow. And he lived, he had not only one palace, but 3 different palaces, depending upon the season. So he lived quite a life of luxury, really in the lap of luxury. Whatever he could possibly need or want was there. And it was a sheltered life, a protected life. It was a good life, you know. I don't know that there was certainly not a lot of physical suffering in his life at that point. There may have been other kinds of suffering. But he got curious. And this curiosity led him, he's like, I want to know what's outside these walls, right? Just like, I want to know what else is outside the wall of how I hold myself. It's like, I'm curious. What's outside these walls? And I think curiosity, to me, this is like one of the most exciting things about the story, because I think curiosity is a doorway. It's that tickle inside that just helps us to investigate a little bit further, to pay attention, to look for what else may be there. Certainly the familiar is there, but is there something else? And so this curiosity became the fuel. So he asked his charioteer to take him outside of the palace walls and to the nearby village. He was like, what else is here? And so he took several trips outside of these palace walls to see what else. And during this time, he saw someone who was ill and frail and sick. And he wondered, who is that? You know, what? Because he's only had seen people who were in good, strong, vital health. And another time out, he saw somebody who was aged. He had been sheltered from that too. And another time out, he saw a corpse. And each time he asked his charioteer, who are these people? And his charioteer explained, oh, aging, illness, death. These are part of basic humanity that he had been shielded from. And so, aging, illness, and death, they poked Siddhartha in some way. They woke him up in some way. They startled him in some way to see things as they are, to wake up to reality, to wake up to the changing nature of reality, the impermanence of all things. And so these aging, illness, and death became known as the heavenly messengers. Because even though it was difficult for Siddhartha to see this, they woke him up. He saw things in a whole different way, and he became curious. He wanted to know more. And he not only saw the people outside of him suffering from these things, but he also realized that I too am the nature to grow old. I too am the nature to get sick. I too, this body that I'm living in, also will die. And not only that, all of those near and dear to me, this is true for them also. So you can imagine this awakening, this realization, how startling. And maybe some of you here have a memory of when you first realized your own mortality. You know, some of us became aware of that quite young. Some of us are still forgetting that that's true. So you might just think, when did that and how did that impact you? For Siddhartha, it led him deeper into his spiritual path. In Pali, which is the canonical literature of the Buddhist times, there's a term called samvega. And it kind of describes that sudden awareness, that shock, that something that comes in that all of a sudden everything changes. You just seeing things differently. You get it in some ways. It's almost like a startle or a shock. And it can have the effect of really kind of leveling things off, resetting the priorities, really shaking everything up. So this meeting with the first three heavenly messengers was that samvega experience for Siddhartha. And it brings about like such a shock. It kind of blows us out of the water, shakes up our complacency. Has anybody had that kind of experience? Yeah, yeah. And sometimes it happens once. Sometimes there's many of those kind of an insight, a waking up, a getting it. And these are gifts for us. But sometimes after that insight, as time passes and we live on, we tend to forget. And we forget maybe what that insight was or what that lesson was. And sometimes this samvega occurs not only because of a shock that's difficult, a death or illness, a diagnosis or something like that. Sometimes wonder and a sense of sheer beauty that takes our breath away can wake us up to a larger reality, can snap us out of the fog that we often live in. Some way that the heart gets pierced. It's a wake-up call. And I'll share. This is always a difficult story for me to share, but it has a happy ending, so I'm going to start with that. But it's difficult because I sometimes still forget the gift that was given to me with an experience of samvega. And this was a number of years ago, and when my boys were young, they were little guys, and we were on vacation with a group of friends, and we were by this river, and we were in a section of the river where there were some rapids, and the older kids were kind of in an inner tube and going down the rapids. And so the whole thing made me a little bit nervous, but the kids were having a ball, and I was with a group of friends who were very experienced river people. They knew the river well. And so my youngest son, our youngest son, Bodhi, said, I want to go. And I'm like, no way. You can, you're too young. You can't do it. And, he begged and begged. And one of the dads said, I'll put him in the tube with me. It's going to be fine. He'll be safe. And in the long run, he was. And so there was something in my body, in my belly, and I think I didn't pause to discern, is this, general mommy anxiety, or is there like a warning in here, like danger, don't do this? And so I said, okay. And Bodhi was thrilled. He hopped in the inner tube with our friend Steve. They start going down. It was a short stretch of rapids. They start going down the rapids, and of course, they tumble out. They fall out of the inner tube. And there's Bodhi, because he's a little body, just rolling down the river, full of rocks. And, I feel like I'm holding my breath just telling you this story. He came out fine. He was like, can I do it again? And I was like, never. And I realized, the wake up for me was, I didn't listen to my inner guide, my knowing. I knew. And I didn't listen to that. And it could have cost him his life. So easily. He could have hit his head on a rock. So it was a samvega. And it taught me, pay attention to that feeling listen to it, there's guidance there. And I have gotten better at listening to it, but there's times I forget. And maybe I'm telling this story so I remember, because as we know, things can change like that. Things could have so easily have gone different. For my son, for our family, for our friends. So this waking up, this paying attention, this not leaving anything out, really knowing what's being experienced in this body and trusting the inner wisdom of that. So that was a little tangent, but I also want to say that there was another heavenly messenger that the Buddha met. And again, when his charioteer took him out, he saw this monk who was meditating. And he paid attention to him. He got curious. Who is this? And it was somebody trying to understand the causes of suffering and the awakening that can lead to freedom. And this again woke the Buddha up. And he left his home, his family, his wife, his son, the palace, the road to glory that was laid out for him. And when you think of it, that's really radical. You know, that's really radical to leave all the comforts, all that's familiar, and to put on robes, to wander, to beg for your food, and to live a life investigating what is this suffering and how can I be liberated from it. And again, I think it was that love for truth, this wanting to know, that ignited his curiosity, that helped him, that gave him the energy to leave the palace. And I think he also knew that our freedom is up to us. It's an inside job, and it's up to us. And I think this is one of the things that our practice can teach us, is that we can cultivate an inner steadiness, an equanimity, a resilience, so that when the river's moving fast and when life is hitting us with many changes, we can have a steadiness inside to help us find our way. And I think within each of us, there's a seed of awakening that's calling us forth. And I think for me, one of the things that calls me to practice not only this desire for freedom, but this deep interest and curiosity in the mystery. I feel like that's been with me all of my life. What is this mystery? Who are we? And how did we get here? And it's so compelling to me. I think this mystery, it started early, and as I was preparing this talk, I had this memory of a child, quite young, kneeling, we said prayers at bedtime, and kneeling before my bed and saying, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Every night. And I know there's other versions of that prayer where you have angels come and escort you till you wake up in the morning. But I had the version that had death in it. That if I die tonight, please take me. But I didn't know, who the Lord was. That was a scary person to me. I didn't know where I would be taken to. And what if I wasn't taken? So it was all very confusing and mysterious to me. But I think that mystery has stayed with me. And I think there's a sense of the shadow of death has followed me all my life. And it's a gift in a way. It doesn't necessarily feel like a morbid preoccupation, but there's something that's here reminding me of the preciousness and fragility. That both of those go together. That's like a samvega. Preciousness and fragility. I'm hoping to return to that prayer, but I like the part where the angels escort you and help wake you up safely in the morning. There's something very sweet about that. So I may have to learn a new version of that prayer. But I think this was a heavenly messenger for me. This prayer was its own way, it was my heavenly messenger. For many years, I had the opportunity to do hospice work, both as a nurse and as a chaplain. And so I've been with many people who've died and have been with their loved ones and family members. And often, family members, when a loved one would die, family members would ask if I would officiate at the memorial or the funeral service, and was asked to deliver the eulogy. And sometimes it was someone I had only met in their last breaths. Other times it was people maybe I had known for a few weeks or a few months. And so, how to talk about someone's life who I didn't really know, but the family didn't have anyone else to deliver the eulogy. And so when I would meet with the family, I would ask them, to tell me about their loved one, what they loved, what they cherished, what they struggled with. What were their times of joy and sorrow? I was, and I realize it now, I was asking about their heavenly messengers. I didn't use that language, I didn't use that term, but that's what I wanted to know, because those were the turning points in somebody's life. Those were the things that shaped a person's life. Who were their heavenly messengers? What were those moments that impacted somebody's life? Those joys, those sorrows, those changes. How's everybody doing? You up for another little story? Okay. This is a story about my dad, and oh, I got a tear thinking about him. Yeah. My dad was a heavenly messenger for me. And he wasn't always the easiest person. He had a couple different sides, as many of us do. He was complex. And there was a part of him that was really scary and angry, and he could be mean and cruel, and, I was afraid of him. But there was another part of my dad that really put me in touch with the mystery. And I sometimes think, had he been alive many, many years ago, that he would have wrote the William Blake poem, "To see infinity in a grain of sand." Because when we would go to the beach, he would talk about that, like, look at this. No two are alike. And there was a period of time that my dad moved to Arizona. I wasn't living with him. He wasn't living with the family. And my siblings and I, we would go to visit him, and he loved Arizona. It's a beautiful state. And he would put us in the car like early in the morning, and we probably drove, I guess in kilometers, over 500 kilometers in a day. He would take us to Oak Creek Canyon and the Grand Canyon and the Painted Desert and the Painted Rocks and all over the place. And each place he was like, look at this, look at this, look at this. He was like in this awe. So on one of these days, it was so long, and we were so tired, and hungry. It was probably 10 o'clock at night, and we were sort of done, my brother and sister and I, with getting in and out of the car to look at another wonder. We were just tired and cranky and hungry. But he drove up this mountain, Mount Humphreys, in Flagstaff, and it was 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, cold, hungry, and he said, get out of the car. And there's nothing there. We're in the middle of nowhere. And he said, look. And I've never seen stars like that. It's like, oh my God. Like, I loved my dad that he drove us like all the way up Mount Humphreys to like see this incredible blanket of stars. It's like, So wonder can also be that some Waygu experience, waking us up. I hope the clouds go so I can see the Denmark stars. So I think for each of us, we've had these experiences, but they sometimes don't last. And so we practice to awaken to what's here, because I'm sure many of you have experienced that the ordinary always holds the extraordinary if we're present to it. It's always here. the ordinary and the extraordinary, they're not two separate things. They're always together. But often we're not paying attention. I can't remember who said it. I'll look it up. But so there was a quote of something about delight is the gift of paying attention. And so pay attention to this ordinary. If you're doing a yogi job, and if you're sweeping, or if you're washing the dishes or cutting up the vegetables, be as present as you can, because the extraordinary is right there. So I'll give a little example. Washing dishes, I'm at home washing dishes, not paying too much attention. But when my little niece comes over and I stand her on a chair and put her in front of a sink with water, oh my God, she is having so much fun. Like, it's extraordinary. Put a little child in front of water, and like, how delightful is that? She's pouring water into one cup and the other and onto the floor and turning it on. It was a mess. And such delight, such joy. So for many years, I've really searched. I wanted to know the answers to these mysteries, this mystery, and like some ultimate truth, so I could kind of like tie it all up and organize my life, and like it all fit like on a page or organized, or like that everything made sense. Like, I want to know, like, what's the ultimate? What's the final resting page? Where's the perch that I can land on? And I've come to understand that there's no final destination. This mystery isn't going away. So even though we live in this mystery and it's unending, there's still a path to awakening, a path that can help us lessen suffering, a path that can bring us insight and wisdom and open our hearts with compassion. And I think this path, it's alive. It's always beginning. It's always here. It's always with us. And it's a matter of attention, of waking up, of really seeing what's here. Bob, when I told him I was going to talk about the heavenly messengers, and he asked me, well, tell me about your fourth messenger. And he knows my messengers, and of course my spiritual teacher and Sangha. But I've come to think of my fourth messenger, I guess I call them the hidden saints. Like, there's so many people around us who are offering kindness, that there's just hidden saints all around us that just can help change the channel to wake up a little bit. We have an elderly neighbor. She's almost 90. And every day she walks down the street pushing her walker, and she always waves and says hi. And if I'm outside, she asks about my day. And there's something about her brightness and her sunniness that she's a heavenly messenger for me. She's one of those hidden saints who just happens to live across the street from me. And I get blessed by her smile and her joy and her kindness. This was probably last summer now, but you might be aware that in Northern California, last summer, there was a lot of really very harsh and devastating wildfires, and even though we live some distance from that, we could still smell the smoke. And there was a town called Paradise that the fire just rolled through so fast, people barely got out, and not everybody did. So one day I was at the gas station pumping gas, and next to me there was a gentleman in a pickup truck pumping gas, and he struck up a conversation, and, how you doing? And then he started talking about the weather, and there was a little bit of sprinkle, it was a little bit of rain, and he said, I'm so happy for the rain. And then he started to tell me, so we just had a little chit-chat. Well, it wasn't long because we were both pumping gas, and he told me that his sister had been in Paradise, and she lost her home, her dog, her car, all of her possessions, and literally got out with the clothes on her back. And then he said to me, as I'm screwing my gas cap on, he said, it doesn't really matter. He said, the only thing that really matters is this, you and I, right here, talking. He says, that's what matters. And I feel like, oh yeah, heavenly messenger at the gas pump, right? Like a hidden saint right there. This is what matters, right here. This brief exchange at the gas pump, this brief kindness, this brief reminder of, hey, we're okay, my sister got out. This is what really matters. So I think there's lots of hidden saints in this room and lots of heavenly messengers in this room. And it's such a gift, it's such good fortune to be able to practice together, because we don't wake up alone. We need one another to help us wake up, to remind us of the possibility that we can be free, to remind us of how far a little kindness can go, to remind us that the ordinary and the extraordinary are right at the gas pump, or right walking down my street when my neighbor Jean waves. It's all right here in front of us. So it's important that we look around and just say, oh, there's a hidden saint right there. We're all helping each other. So maybe why we practice is our heart just calling us to come home. Like just calling us to come home to our own bodies, our minds, our hearts, to come home just to this moment. I like to think about practice as coming home. Just coming home. I'll share one final short story. When I was a little girl, I grew up in a neighborhood in Michigan, and I had, there were 6 kids in my family. And when it was dinner time, my mother would stand on the front porch, and at the top of her lungs, she would yell, "Ding, ding, dinner bell." And she'd say it a number of times, "Ding, ding, dinner bell." And so, we'd come from across the street or from the basement or the backyard, or, there weren't cell phones to call you home at that time. But she was calling us home for nourishment. She was calling us home to be together, to nourish us. And I think that's what this practice is doing. And so whatever we're doing can be our meditation bell. It doesn't have to be a real bell. It doesn't have to be your mom on the porch yelling at the top of her lungs. Anything. Everything we do here can be our meditation bell. And I'll just end with this quote from Ram Dass that I quite like. And he says, we're all just walking each other home. Isn't that beautiful? We're all just walking each other home. So let's practice and walk each other home. Let's just sit for a few minutes and then we'll move into a walking meditation.